Hi, all great. So, this is the recorded lecture for chapter 4, which really focuses on independence. But let me just go back to the beginning of this and just kind of start again somewhat at the start. Now, chapter 1 to 3 we had spent discussing what an assurance engagement was really all about and breaking up the assurance engagement into the audit and, if you like, to the other sort of assurance engagements, and highlighting difference in opinion, so to speak, the difference between limited giving limited assurance and giving reasonable assurance, and we discussed that. This chapter just kind of goes on to now focus on the audit itself, if you like, and the nature of the relationship, if you like, and just highlight really the role or the responsibility, I guess, if you like, of the auditor when he or she goes in there, and who they're really responsible to. We talked about this question of this issue of stakeholders, and that the fact that if you like, the auditor was responsible to a set of stakeholders, and in order to be able to give in, to be trusted, in order for their word, so to speak, or their opinion to be trusted, they had to ensure that they had been independent in their assessment of the financial statements. So fundamentally, this lecture is about independence. It's about separating yourself and making sure that you are not just independent, but you are seen to be independent. If you like, very clearly separating your relationships from the client, so to speak, the directors of the accounts. The closer you are to them, then the harder it is to prove that that there has been no bias, if you like, in the conclusion that you have come to, or just as you can imagine, the fact that you can actually make a conclusion and without feeling as though there's been any pressure. So that's the first thing. So the big word here is independence. Independence. And what is independence? So professional accountants have a responsibility to act in the public interest, if you like. And so the purpose of assurance engagements is to increase the confidence, like I said earlier on, of the intended user. So to a certain extent, only certain people, as you can imagine, therefore can be auditors, which is otherwise, I mean, why you wouldn't trust the director of a company to be a director, because of course he would be acting, or she would be acting, in the interests of the company. So therefore, in order to ensure, again, like I say, the purpose here is to increase the confidence of the intended user. So therefore, the users need to trust the professional who is providing the assurance. So what we're looking for here is this need for, again, like I say, objectivity, from the point of view of the users, to see that we are not, if you like, yes, our decision making has not been impaired. So we need not just to behave independently, we need to be seen to behave in an ethical and professional manner. So fundamentally, I think I highlighted before that here in the UK we take an approach of trust, that we trust that people will follow certain fundamental principles. So really, at the heart of it, there are certain fundamental principles that really, in effect, should be enough, and that we should be like, oh, listen, these are the fundamental ethical codes for you to live by. And as you live by those codes, we can trust what you say. Now the question is, why do we have these codes? Well, fundamentally because we have threats, if you like, to our general idea of morality. Yes, and so the question here is that under normal circumstances, we ensure that even though there are threats around, people know that there is a way or principle to live by, and we hope people live by these principles. And so, in effect, you can call that code or that morality a code of ethics, if you like, so to speak. So again, like I'm highlighting here, in order to be trusted, the assurance provider needs to be independent of their client. That almost goes without saying. And this really is the process of arriving at these codes. Um, Last week we talked about IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, and how they are responsible. They're based in New York, and they're responsible for not just the setting of the IAASB, the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, but they're also through the IESBA, the International Ethics Standards Board. For accountants, they are also able to come up with a framework. And many of these frameworks are very similar. They all line up. The IFAC Code of Ethics. So what we're really dealing with here are the standard code that you would have studied at AAT, or if you've come through a degree route at ACCA, even ICAW will all share these fundamental code of ethics. So the ACCA Code of Ethics, nothing new. It's the same. I imagine the AAT code is exactly the same thing that we will come to see. But I think again, like you already heard me talking about this earlier on, the principle here is that we have a we have a conceptual framework. We have a way of thinking about this so that we understand what's happening here. So, like I said earlier on, a framework, because we're not talking about rules here, we're talking about principles that structure the way we deal with threats that arise. You see, because we cannot quite write down every single threat. We don't know what all the threats could be. But so what we do know is that if we have principles, then we can on a principled approach, taking a principled approach, an informed approach, a faithful approach, deal with a unique any unique threat arising. Right. And so this is what you heard me talking about earlier on, this question of morality, this question of principles, having them in place. And if we have those principles in place, then we are able to um, manage any threats as they come along. Now, the truth is that, like all things in life, you might have great principles in place. Of course, that's always a good thing, but because and we can't do anything, there will always be threats, there will always be challenges, there'll always be obstacles, there'll always be, if you like, an opportunity to deviate or to act not in the best interests of your client. And when I say client here, I'm talking about your stakeholders, your shareholders. Remember, directors are agents who work for the client, so your job is to really look and examine what they're doing and seeing that they are managing the organization faithfully in the interests of the shareholders and the relevant stakeholders. We also have an idea of, therefore, okay, listen, if we can't quite trust people to live by those principles, or if they're confused, what we can do is give them a series of safeguards. So we can put a series of safeguards in place to aid and enable them deal better with those threats. So your classic exam question is really a case of you'll be given a scenario, and what you have to do is to identify very clearly what the threats are, um, if you like. And when you identify those threats, you then have to recommend appropriate safeguards for those threats. Apologies if there's any noise in the background. It's we are in the corona times of homeschooling. Um, so I guess the question is, what are the fundamental principles? Hopefully, you're not hearing much noise in the background. What are these fundamental principles? So the first key one is the question of, or this principle of integrity. Yes, I mean, a popular word. When people talk about integrity, they talk about honesty, they talk about trust, sincerity, that sort of thing. Those are the big words, really. And we expect professional accountants to have a certain level of integrity. So, to doing the right thing even when no one is watching. So, really acting in the best interest, if you like, of the client, being honest, if you like, um, and doing the right straightforward, yes, doing the straightforward and honest thing in all their professional and business relationships. That might, you can see that these are principles. So it's not about, oh, Oyen, am I talking about the accounts? Am I talking about hiding information? Is it about the setting of a provision? Is it about working and making sure you test everything? Forgive me when I say everything, that I actually look at my sample. Um, you see, or if I'm asked about something, I say I know it's false, and I say, well, I'm not sure, or I avoid answering the question. That's what we're talking about here. So you can see that the scenarios are so open that you just have to apply the principle of being straightforward and very aware of the question you're being asked and answering that question. So what I'll try and do is I try and make these in short burps, bleeps, so that you don't have to sit throughout an entire full lecture. So that's the first. That's the first. That's the first part. So we'll do them in short 10-minute bits. So the key point here is that we have just looked, if you like, fundamentally at the fact that we're talking about independence, and we have a conceptual framework for tackling this question of independence. And the framework is what helps us to understand the fact that there are threats, if you like, to how we do our work. But we must have inherently certain core principles, core ethical codes that we must follow when we're doing our work. There are threats to these every day. So, what we must in effect do is to put safeguards in place to guide us. So those safeguards are not laws; they're standards, if you like, and advisory sort of statements that enable us to actually carry out our work. And therefore, and then the first of those fundamental principles that we just saw was one of integrity. So in the next video, we will look at the next series of principles, but I'll try and do them in about 12 minutes each. See you in the next video.